Hello and welcome to Spokane County Spotlight. I'm Commissioner Shelley O'Quinn, and my guests today are Deputy Chief Tim O'Brien with the Spokane Valley Fire Department and Deputy Director Ed Lewis with Greater Spokane Emergency Management. Welcome and thank you both for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
We are nearing the one-year anniversary of the worst weather event Spokane County has ever seen. On November 17th, 2015, hurricane-like winds pummeled eastern Washington and northern Idaho. The devastation of the storm was tremendous, and in the aftermath, over 200,000 customers lost power throughout the region. So as we approach this time of year again, and with winter just around the corner, I've asked my guests here today to discuss the importance of emergency management. So again, thank you both for joining us. This is an important conversation for us to have. So to get started, Ed, why don't you give us some information on what Greater Spokane Emergency Management does?
Okay, very good. Greater Spokane Emergency Management is created by an interlocal agreement first in the county to provide emergency management services. So someone might ask, what does that mean? The reality is every response organization or entity has their own plans to come together at time of crisis. But those are all in silos, if you will. And so emergency management's role is to coordinate and facilitate those activities, in particular at time of crisis. So that's really what we do through the interlocal. Here locally, we have 13 jurisdictions that have signed on to the interlocal agreement. So we have a single office of emergency management, which really is a very effective and efficient model.
Are there any challenges with having to work with so many different jurisdictions?
Yes. We are dealing with people, but in the end of the day, it's all about relationships. And so bringing those folks together, in particular in the planning phases when everyone is busy, is quite a challenge. We come together at time of crisis, but that planning and preparing for it really is a challenge to get people to come and plan for.
So let's talk about how you had to deal with some of those challenges as the major windstorm approached, and what were some of those series of events that led up to?
Well, I think first and foremost is we had a weather event, and we had the opportunity, all of us had the opportunity to be prepared for that. We have a tendency, I think human beings have a tendency of saying, it's just another weather event.
It's just another windstorm.
It's just another windstorm. Right. So in that particular case, through the system working, we actually had one of our partner agencies contact us and say, we should probably stand up or get together and talk about the potential of this wind event. And we had had a number of opportunities before that, all of us had, to say this is going to be real. The National Weather Service actually did a great job of trying to prepare all of us. But we live in an area that doesn't oftentimes see disasters. Right. So it's hard for folks to oftentimes listen to that and come to the table.
So did you really find that people were paying attention to the warnings that you were giving, or not really?
The warnings after the fact, I believe they did. Pre that, with the Weather Service's attempts to inform all of us, I think some folks, including myself, probably looked at that and said, that might be bad if it happens. Once they got us to the table, we actually called together emergency management, our job, bringing folks together at time of, or potential at time of crisis. We sent an email out early on the day of the windstorm to all of our partner agencies, specifically focused on law enforcement, fire, utilities, and said we need to get together, and if this wind event does in fact cause the damage that it could, and it did, we developed a series of trigger points to bring people back together at time of action. So those things happened up front.
Right, and I do know that the city and the county both sent, we sent all of our employees home at 3 o'clock and encouraged folks to get home and to stay in place. But did you find that people were letting their employees go home early? Did you find that people stayed in place, or were the roads still packed at the point of the storm?
Well, I believe, again, I'm not certain that everyone, obviously, yielded to that warning. I mean, that's just plain and simple. But a lot of people did. Right. And so we continued to put that out there. We put a shelter in place order out, and those things are hard to do, because right. We're telling people you've got to go, in this particular case, shelter in place, because it's for your own safety.
And I think what we found out, and what we will discuss in a little while, is that shelter in place, most people didn't know what that meant. It was not, because we are not a community that necessarily experiences a lot of disasters. It was a first for many.
Yeah, from a fire department perspective, pre-event, we didn't notice significant change. We did a lot of pre-preparation. We're prepared every day to respond to whatever emergency happens, but we know this is going to be a significant event. We're going to need extra personnel. We're going to need to make sure our personnel are notified so they can take care of their families at home.
Right.
Because once they're at work, they're not going to be able to go home and take care of their own families. So they have to have a certain amount of preparation as employees. We did let our employees leave in the admin building at 2 p.m., for example, so they could go home. And you know, once the event starts happening, I think people realize that, hey, this is significant, and maybe we should go home. We should pay attention to that message we've been getting for the last 24 hours.
Yeah, and that was a difficult night, and then it was just crazy waking up the next morning and seeing all of the damage that everyone experienced. Can you just talk through some of the events of that night and I guess the progression of the storm as it came through and then the aftermath?
So again, prior to the storm, we pulled together the community partners to have a conversation and develop specific trigger points of when we're going to have to enact or bring together the Emergency Coordination Center and stand it up. So as that occurred, those folks went back to their given jurisdictions, did preparation and those kinds of things internally, and then the wind event started to occur. So we encouraged folks to go home, just as you had stated earlier. We put the shelter-in-place order out as we recognize this storm is real. If you looked at the graphic that showed the arrow of that energy was coming straight to Spokane, and in fact, obviously it did. And then the entire system, by its own nature, becomes overloaded with requests for emergency responses, and then you start triaging those. That's part of the emergency coordination process.
And what was your biggest request during that evening and the next day from folks?
Well, it was different. You could tell when the wind event was going to hit. Our call volume, the calls for service, skyrocketed.
Correct.
But we had upstaffed, added personnel, staffed 5 other additional pieces of equipment, those type of things, anticipating that this was going to happen, and it did. Normally in Spokane Valley, Millwood, Liberty Lake area, we're going to run about 40 calls for service a day. We were up to, just in that shift, 133, for example.
Wow. Most
of those occurred during the wind event itself. And at that point in time, we have to change the way we operate because spread your resources thin. And while we have automatic aid with our neighboring jurisdictions, they're busy too.
Right.
So you don't have all the help that you would normally have.
Especially in a regional storm like this.
Correct. So you have to be more self-reliant, and we were prepared for that. And we start sending single engine responses instead of multi-company responses, for example. And you know, like Ed says, we triage. Try to go to divert to the most important one if you have to, and they get stacked up. But eventually we get to them all. Nobody is left.
Right, and you know, in many ways we're still recovering from this storm. You can still drive around Spokane and you can still see blue tarps on houses as folks have not had the opportunity to have their roofs replaced. And in many places you still see down trees where they haven't had a chance to remove those trees. But it has, I believe, brought around an awareness, or at least we hope, of the importance of being prepared for an emergency. And that's one of the pieces of this conversation we want to make sure we have today is making sure we're prepared. But first, let's talk about what are some of the other types of emergencies that we have had in Spokane historically, and could potentially see in the future.
Historically, in Spokane, we have seen windstorms, obviously weather-related events. We've had the ice storm, winter storms, windstorms. We have wildland fires, which are part of our environment, and we've seen those periodically. Again, the real key for us in trying to get people to prepare and plan is we live in a beautiful area. We live here for a reason. And some of that is it's a beauty and a curse that we don't have more events like this to make sure people are prepared and plan and then ultimately stay informed and into the process. So we've had way back when, the volcano that erupted. Earthquakes are not part of our dialogue most of the time, although we certainly have some exposure there. And from a preparation perspective, we just went through the Cascadia subduction zone exercises in June, And that makes us think about, wow, if something that catastrophic were to happen in the state of Washington or on the West Coast, how would that affect Spokane and all of us? And it's a significant undertaking.
Right, so there's a variety of incidents that have happened in our history, even though rare, thankfully. We have a lot to be thankful for there that we do need to be prepared for.
Wind events seem to be the most common, though. That
At
can
least
happen.
recently.
Yeah, they can happen anytime. And from a fire department perspective, again, the wind events are challenging. Power lines come down. That's a common problem. We found in the windstorm last year that we had power lines that were on cars, school buses, even an ambulance.
Wow.
Okay, that can slow down your response. That can draw resources to help people safely get out of those vehicles. Wind events are very, very, very challenging.
Yes,
and
they are.
seem to be a little more common. They create fire.
They spread fire, as
Yeah.
we saw recently.
Power outage is a very big problem, not only during the event, but in this case, days afterwards.
Right.
We realize there's a lot of people at home that are relying on electricity just for medical reasons,
Right.
to run their air. So we did a lot of follow-up. For example, that second day, checking on people, literally going door to door to make sure that people are okay. It was also winter. It was November, so it was cold. People had lost their ability to heat their homes, which was also challenging because then people start using anything they can, which is often unsafe. For example, running a generator in your garage. We had carbon monoxide issues to deal with. People getting ill from the effects of carbon monoxide, not realizing their generator exhaust is actually poisoning
Is causing
them.
that.
Yeah.
So as we talk about these incidences and we think about how people need to be prepared, as they put together that kit, what are some of the items that they need to make sure they have in their emergency kit?
Well, certainly flashlights, batteries, food. How am I going to deal with 3 or 4 days without food, let alone longer periods of time? There's lots of resources out there, ready.gov, certainly our GSEM .us webpage, those places to go and get resource lists. It's really about what is it I'm going to need, what are the essentials that I'm going to need, getting those essentials gathered up, probably taking some time to do it because it takes a lot to put together the right kind of kit. It may take you a period of time to do that. So thinking about what do I need that might be special? Do I have pets? Are medications that I need to have? Those kinds of things, pre-planning again, that if we get cut off, if the supply lines were disrupted, then how am I going to fill that void?
That's important. And I do know that our folks can also visit the SCRAPS website, Spokane Regional Animal Protection Services, and they can see the emergency kit they should put together for their pets and the instructions that they should have. Because if you think back just to the most recent fires that we had and the evacuations and the evacuations of animals and where do they go, that's important information for people to have ahead of time, not as they're trying to figure out what to do with their animals.
Yeah, I would also advise people to take a look at your property. And for example, is it clear around your property? Is there, loose objects that are going to blow in the wind? Basically just good housekeeping.
Right.
So.
If you have trees that are leaning still, because as you mentioned, driving through the community, there are trees that are still out there that certainly will pose a hazard when the wind blows again from the southwest.
Right, and we know that it will.
We know that
Right.
it will.
It's not a matter of if, it's when will it happen.
So one of the things when we talked about preparing is, again, having the supplies, but then having the plan, having some sort of plan to fall back on. If the supply line is again disrupted for 3 days, what is my plan? How am I going to gather my family? How am I going to communicate with them? Mm-hmm. Those types of things are really, and most of these resources have that type of material that you can get your hands on and look at and put that plan together.
Right. I'd like to go back to one of the instructions that was given during the storm, and that's that shelter-in-place piece. And I know that that's something that people don't often hear, but why don't you have, I believe, have a public service announcement, so why don't you introduce that concept for us?
Yeah, when the wind event occurred, we actually went back and asked the public, when we said shelter in place, did you know what that means? And we all thought that might be the case, it maybe not. And so we put together a PSA and a campaign for shelter in place, and we use a local person, actually a local animal, the marmot, to help us illustrate the importance of shelter in place and the steps that you take. And so we're going to go ahead and show that video right now.
The need to shelter in place can come at any moment. Bring your family and pets inside. Grab your emergency radio and cell phone. Find an interior room with few windows and listen for further instructions. Close all windows, doors, and air vents. Listen for information to know when it's safe to leave your home. For more information about shelter in place, go to www.gsem.us.
That was a great spot, and just as a reminder to folks that they can find more information on that on your website, emergency management website. So probably one of the most frightening times during all of this time is actually the loss of electricity and power. So, or even having to evacuate. So can you talk to us a little bit about what folks can do in those situations and circumstances?
Again, plan. I mean, we talked flashlights, batteries, recharge. You know, if you have a generator, will it in fact start? Do I actually have gasoline enough to keep it running for a number of days, or periodically to keep things charged up? You know, what am I going to use that for? That's part of that planning piece. And so that in and of itself is probably the most critical. If we're going to evacuate, what is it that I have to take with me? Because if you're evacuating, you're not taking everything.
Right.
So what are those few things that I'm going to need to sustain life someplace else for a given period of time? Again, medications primarily. Do I have doctor's orders that I'm going to need? Those kinds of things that people don't often think about that you would want to take, as long as it's a small handful, if you will, and take to wherever you may end up. And that will serve you well down the road if you happen to be evacuated.
Now, the time that you don't want to find out that those batteries are dead in your flashlight is when you're in the middle of a crisis, that is for sure. So can you talk to us about the evacuation orders? Because I know that those are in place to protect people, and there are different levels, and our most recent experience with those was for the fires that we just experienced. But I think it's important for people to understand what the different evacuation levels are and what they actually mean.
Okay, so there are 3 evacuation levels that are utilized. Level 1, level 2, level 3. We don't know numbers, okay? We won't know at the time of crisis. Get ready, get set, go. If you remember those, with those orders, then you'll understand it. When we ask folks to evacuate, it's for their own protection.
Right.
We recognize that they have a right to their property, they have a right to stay there, but as professionals, we don't ask people to evacuate unless we truly think they're in harm's way, and we hope that they will yield to that if asked at time of crisis.
Right.
I'd like to go back and add one more thing on the preparedness. And,
Please.
You know, if you're going to use a generator or whatever you're going to use, make sure you know how to use it safely. What we did notice is chimneys hadn't been cleaned in a while. You know, the flue on a wood-burning stove hadn't been cleaned in a while, and we'd end up with chimney fires as people were burning for long periods of time trying to stay warm. The carbon monoxide issue that I brought up earlier, all those types of things. If you're going to actually think it through and make sure you're prepared to safely use whatever means you've chosen to be prepared.
Well, and as we approach winter, when we have any of these emergency situations happening, it's time, as we do our fall prep work and our emergency preparedness, to make sure that we take care of those items.
And there's one thing I have to say as a firefighter is make sure your smoke detectors are working.
Yes. And make sure you have your carbon monoxide detector as well.
So during the wind event, there were 20 plus people that were treated for carbon monoxide poisoning here in Spokane. And I believe the number was about 7 or 8 that were actually shipped from Spokane to other definitive treatments. So it is a serious problem during these types of events, especially, again, during the cold times that we had and people trying to stay warm.
Well, if you think about even the stay in the shelter-in-place order, I mean, unfortunately, one of the casualties from the storm was someone that a tree fell on their car. And so there are, when these warnings are given, whether it's an evacuation warning, a shelter-in-place warning, it is for the protection of the community.
That's correct.
So, so during an emergency, there's often this outpouring of, donations and offers for assistance. And what's the best advice that you can give to wannabe volunteers?
The fire department is really not at that particular moment in a position to set up an organization and accept and distribute all of those. So we would advise that you find the appropriate community organization to make your donations through.
And I think that's a very important point.
Yeah.
Yes.
Donation management is a system unto itself.
Yes, it is.
And the reality of the majority, people are good, giving individuals, and everyone wants to help. But oftentimes at time of crisis, we create a crisis by virtue of that goodwill.
Right.
My experiences traveling around at major incidents, there are warehouses of well-intended goods that have been delivered during times of crisis, and they're still there in some places. And so what I would ask people to do is think about that. And you may very well be able to give cash resources to local charities that can go out and do that work in those communities, still reaching the people in need and not necessarily sending those other kinds of items. And so we are always caught in that. The incident management team that was here this last summer had to deal with that and said, we really are not asking for the firefighters types of things. And if you want to donate, please donate through some form of charity. And that's a good way to do it.
Well, and the Red Cross is a great organization to actually help on the volunteer side in the coordination of those items. I do know, we saw down in Fire District 8 during the most recent fire, just an outpouring of folks bringing things to the fire stations, which at the middle of a fire is not, it's very well intended. We have such a generous community. It's just hard to manage that right in the middle of a crisis situation.
And we don't want to discourage donations. We just
Not
want them to
at
go
all.
through the right channels.
Exactly. We
Yeah.
want to encourage folks to go to the organizations that are able to handle the influx of donations because we have such a generous community.
Oh, for sure.
And just looking at the aftermath of the firestorms and the windstorms, and it's amazing the generosity that exists in this community. So I do have to ask, as an elected official, do elected officials hinder or hurt your efforts as you are pulling this coordination together?
Well, probably the answer is a little bit of both, maybe.
You're going to say the local ones help you, I'm sure.
No, it's a great asset. As elected officials, you can help us with access or open doors that just aren't available to us, that are necessary in those times. So I would say it's a very large help. You just also have to understand that we're going to devote whatever resources we have to you while you're there,
Right.
which could possibly take away from our mitigation efforts.
Well, and, how about when any of our non-local electeds, state level, governor, president, tell us the impact that can have on an emergency situation.
In particular, what can happen is you can divert the efforts that we want to put on the ground at time of crisis to that visiting individual. It doesn't always happen. It doesn't have to happen, but it does occasionally interfere with the operation. But I want to echo what Tim said, and that is having folks engaged at the appropriate level, at the proper level, and in particular elected and senior officials at a strategic level is critical at time of crisis.
Right, just maybe not necessarily on the fire line.
Strategic level, tactical level.
Exactly.
Two different levels.
So I understand that September was Emergency Preparedness Month, and I believe that you had Fire Prevention Week
In October. Yep.
Is that in October?
It's October.
So maybe if each of you can speak to those.
Well, from a preparedness perspective, it's actually Preparedness Month, that is correct. And so what last week we asked folks to do is to create the plan. And then this coming week, this is the action week. So we are looking for folks to take action. So maybe shelter in place. If you're watching this and you want to sit down and go through what shelter in place is, that would be an action for you and your family. You could go through that. It may very well be an escape drill in the home from a fire perspective. There's lots of opportunity for you to put action into preparedness in case of disaster.
And are all of those action items on your website? So I know we're coming in at the tail end of that month.
I wouldn't say they're all right there, but you could go to ready.gov if you want to see the national emphasis, and you could certainly go to our webpage and get further information on things that you can do to be better prepared.
Perfect. That's a great opportunity for folks to actually practice, especially with children, to make sure that they understand where they go in that environment and situation.
Yeah.
Fire Prevention Week.
It actually turns into Fire Prevention Month, correct?
Fantastic.
Yeah. We'll be very active in the schools, working on exit drills in the home. And it's schools in Millwood, Spokane Valley, Liberty Lake, for example, and we'll touch them all. We'll continue with our smoke detector campaign. This year we want to encourage everybody to replace their smoke detector if it's been in your home more than 10 years. Always change your batteries. We will, if you contact us through our website, or we will be happy to come out and do an inspection in your home.
That's great.
And check it out, give you some advice. That's free. So
an entire
smoke
month.
detectors.
An entire month, and that's your key. Your theme is smoke detectors.
And we even have some smoke detectors we can give you. So
Perfect. So just as we wrap up in the last minute and a half or so, any final thoughts that you have for our listening audience as we go into winter and potentially the next windstorm? Any final thoughts that you want to leave with folks?
Prepare, plan, stay informed.
That's great. That's
Simple
great.
bullets, if you can remember those, you'll be better served.
if you do those things, we're going to have a lot less call volume and really be able to focus on the true emergencies that happen.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today to discuss the importance of preparedness in an emergency situation. I really do appreciate you taking the time. And thank you for everything that your agencies do to keep us safe. I'm afraid that we are out of time today, and I'd like to thank my guests, Deputy Chief Tim O'Brien with the Spokane Valley Fire Department and Deputy Director Ed Lewis with Greater Spokane Emergency Management. I'm County Commissioner Shelley O'Quinn, and thank you for joining us for Spokane County Spotlight.